different technological parts to this virtual space organized by the Zimbabwe Historical Association. Thank you, Zimbabwe Historical Association, for organizing this talk. And thank you, Brian and Percy, who will also be guiding us through this talk on guided mobilities. So a little bit of context to where I am coming from to this talk. My talk today is based on my doctoral dissertation, which is tentatively titled Borderland Governance, Contested Sovereignties and Everyday Life in Northeastern Zimbabwe since the late 1800s. Briefly, this dissertation is a history from below that seeks to highlight the local experiences of what I'm calling borderlanders, basically indigenous Africans who lived or who still live near the Zimbabwe-Mozambique border. My study sites are Honde Valley and Inyanga areas, and I will show that in the next in the visual slides that one of the co-hosts is going to show you. What this my bigger dissertation project is looking at indigenous ideas of space, map making, movements of people, mobilities, which today's talk is more concerned with, and how different people, borderlanders of different classes, desires, and goals, you may say, have had control over their lives for a very long time. And in doing this project, I am emphasizing local ideas of space, movements, and individuals' ways of life to provide what could be called state-centered critique, provide what could be called a critique to state-centered approaches to understanding African borderlands. To give you a little bit of visual context, I will ask Percy to help me with some slides. Percy, do you hear me?
Yes.
Could you please share those maps and images so that we put people into context here?
Great. I will start sharing now. Are you able to view my screen?
Yeah, I can see it. So what you see here on your screen is a map of what's called Rhodesia in the late 1880s. It's a colonial map, and the areas marked in pink would be present-day Zimbabwe, Zambia, and some parts of Botswana. You could move to the next slide. The next slide that Percy is going to show is a sketch of what I am, calling the Greater Zambezi borderlands. And I will do more work to develop this map. But, my Greater Zambezi borderlands idea is, coming from the northwestern parts of Zimbabwe into the Botswana border, and then moving to present-day Victoria Falls, into the areas east to Mozambique, into Tete, and also other areas, including Manyika in Mozambique. And in the next slide, Percy is going to show you what my Manyika borderlands look like. You can go a bit back, Percy. Yes. So my Manyika borderlands from the map of 1892 to the current Google map would include areas of Nyanga, Honde Valley, also Manyika, Mutare, into neighboring Katandika regions of Mozambique to the north. And what's interesting when I was trying to think about maps is that on the Mozambican side of the border, the contemporary border, you see the Manyika region that is spelled differently from the Manyika that I'm thinking about. And in northern Zambia, there is a region called Manyika as well. So that's one thing to think about. Percy, could you move to the next pictures? So again, a route of David Livingstone, one of the travelers, the Vazungu that I'm talking about in my paper today, that I'm using to map the Greater Zambezi borderlands. The next slide, per se, will show what travel guides look like in the 1850s and 1890s and 1900s. You know, to the right of your screen, I think you will see a picture of men called Kutente and Piso, who were African travelers, African hunters who lived near in the Manyika region, covering areas that were called the Makombe territory then. And the other picture shows African guides helping David Livingstone across the Zambezi River. The next slide is a contemporary one that I, took in Honde Valley in 2019. And this is a Pungwe River region where you see that man called Gurure. He is, called a guide locally. Others describe him as a fisherman and the pool keeper of the Pungwe River pool, which is called Mashiri. The next slide, there are gentlemen crossing a river which is called Rera, and locals call this river a local boundary. The man whose hand is up, is raised, is my father. He has been a true friend and a guide for me in different ways, intellectually, socially, and spiritually. So thank you, Percy, for sharing that. So the pictures that you have seen have motivated me to think about what I'm calling everyday mobilities across Manyika and the Zambezi River and the Zambezi borderlands. My temporal and spatial configurations are motivated by themes and the different paths that people followed in their travels. In my conceptualizations of space and time, I am combining these two regions that I call Manyika and the Greater Zambezi, and the period of the late 1880s and 1900s into a single or combined analytical category to think really about people's connections, whether local or translocal or trans-territorial, and how their relationships over time have been connected by different socio-economic and political ways of life that created some disconnections as well, fraternizations, disengagements over more than a century-long period. So through this chapter, that is my dissertation, chapter 2, where this talk is based on, I emphasize the everyday interactions between both Manyika travelers and European travelers. The talk on my chapter, it really seeks to cross physical boundaries and temporal ones in thinking about space and movements. While my focus really is on Manyika, my ideas of space, my analysis of ideas of space and movements really connects or builds upon scenes from across the borders of Manyika into the Zambezi region and other parts of Botswana, Mozambique, and Zambia. Manyika words, oral traditions, local spatial representations, and temporal ones help me to cross different boundaries of thought and knowledges. And their words, the Manyika people's words, oral traditions, and ideas of space have come to shape my intellectual mobilities. So next, I am going to ask, what mobilities are we talking about? Or am I thinking about in my talk today? I'm going to take you through a different series of economic, social, and political mobilities that happened in Manyika and beyond. Whose mobilities I am concerned with? I am really interested in thinking about the mobilities of African borderlanders. And who are these people? These people include expert hunters, Vadzimba, fishermen, as you have seen in the scenes, Varauri, Varwi, warriors, healers, Nganga, Vatetereki, lone travelers, Vakuru, elders, including grandmothers, Vanambuya, and grandfathers, Vanasekuru. This category also includes refugees, Vapoteri, defectors, Vampanduki, Vavengi, enemies, Makororo robbers, and other people. The second category of travelers that I'm concerned with are the European ones. So I will next talk about African borderlanders, mobilities. I will start sharing a proverb, a Manyika proverb, and I'll give a translation. The Shona proverb, the Manyika proverb, that says, Muziu enzira yeparuware ndiye mfambi wayo. Translated to, you can give many translations, but for this study, I have translated it to the philosopher of the path is its traveler. Another proverb, Kukira gomo upoterera, which means to go, to climb a mountain, one has to go about it, to go around it. So these ideas of travel in space are really central to Manyika's ways of travel and how they defined, their different spaces, be it in physical ways or philosophical or social ways. Manyika ideas of space are full of metaphors. Sometimes words like gomo, for example, are using for establishing social boundaries between people and their local leaders. And for one to traverse or to move around these social boundaries, they have to follow a specific path. And this is the path that I'm calling Nzira, a way of life and a way of travel. And this path is always a guided one. Among the Manyika, hunters and traders and warriors, for example, have over time created different maps, physical, mental ones, across their different parts. Along, in the process, they've also generated their own local discourses and philosophies that over time into the colonial period, for example, contradicted with the colonizers' border-making practices. And of course, sometimes also contradicted with European travelers' ideas of geography, ideas of travel. These philosophies have remained over time everyday, important to their everyday, to the Manyika people's everyday travels. Who were the Manyika guides? Some might wonder. In this period that I'm concerned with, people like chiefs were guides. Paramount chiefs like Tendai Chifamba Usiku, the night traveler, Mutasa, was a very important guide. Other warriors such as Mchiraundu, whose name translated is the war cloth, guided war strategies. Others like Sahumani, who lived near the Honde Valley, the Honde Gorge, guided chiefs like Mutasa in conducting local ceremonies such as the crocodile ceremony. In my long paper, I give details about that ceremony. Other spirit mediums, such as and Vadzimu, such as Nyamatondo, among the Manyika, Nyakwanika, Chikanga, Muredzwa, and others, were very important guides over time. These guides, I argue, were knowledge experts who generated local maps and routes, mental or physical ones, which they orally transmitted across generations. They also shared their knowledges with different travelers, such as Vazungu, or the foreigners, white travelers that my next part will examine, will talk about, who by the late 1850s had begun to visit Manyika for different reasons, and the Zambezi borderlands for other different reasons. The knowledges that the Manyika guides shared with travelers were also appropriated or exploited for different agendas by colonizers and these Europeans. But I argue that foreigners, particularly Livingstone and others, for example, Cowpeaters, were guided. And there's very little to say about, them being knowledge experts about African territories. So my next part, I'm going to talk through, the Vazungu, or European travelers and their guided mobilities. In my examination, I rely on travel accounts, and a lot has been said about the questions of their reliability, which is very important. But in my study, I emphasize their usability. And accounts left by people such as Cowpeaters, Paiva de Andrade, Charlotte Mansfield, Frederick Selou, and others really provide important details of journeying, of travel across Manyika and the greater Zambezi borderlands. I treat these accounts as witnesses and experiences, the witnesses of the politics of travel and guided mobilities in the 19th century and 20th centuries. Although Vazungu or white travelers, travel dates are separated by decades, they are connected in that they frequently witness guided mobilities. So what's really interesting in these accounts that I look at is that while Europeans were often dismissive of Africans' abilities to know their geography, they were also found unintentionally revealing that they utilized Africans' ideas of their, physical and spiritual terrains. And the European guides' travels are usually, loaded with racist remarks about African communities and African people and their communities. But by a closer look at them, they contradict Europeans' claims of discovering the beauties of African geography. I want to quote a little bit from David Livingstone and Charlotte Mansfield's account. Livingstone, for example, I will read, in 1856, while traveling in the greater Zambezi borderlands, near present day, the border of Zambia, of Botswana and Zimbabwe, closer to the Victoria Falls. He stated that a local guide, a local man called Sabeku, pointed out to a district 2.5 days distance where there is a hot fountain which emits steam. There, he said, had Sebitwane been alive, he would have brought you to live with you. He would have been on the bank of the river, and by taking canoes, you would at once sail down to the Zambezi and visit the white people at the sea. By this account, Sabeku, the African guide, or the African knowledge expert, clearly demonstrated his geographical knowledge in his local terms. He knew how to navigate the Zambezi River by way of canoeing. He knew that the river connected to the seas. He knew the beauty of his country well before the Europeans arrived. I argue. The hot fountain which emits steam he mentioned is the mighty Mosoatunya, which Livingstone later named Victoria Falls. However, what is clear from this account is that Livingstone was simply guided to the falls. He was just a tourist, not a discoverer of the Mosoatunya. Another account which I'm going to quote is from Charlotte Mansfield, another European traveler in 1906, who in the Greater Zambezi also said that, I quote, "At first, one is astonished at the manner in which natives not only find their own way, but know so much as regards to locality, and distance. It is never wise for a white person to go a short distance from a camp without a native in attendance. He will guide you back to the camp, no matter if he knows little or nothing of the country. And at first, you are astonished that then you realize that for generations, these men have nature's lessons and they are far more happy with their knowledge than they will be when books will contradict and education mystify." By Mansfield's account, the guides were important historical actors, I argue. And without them, we possibly could not have the maps that we have today. From my reading of Mansfield's accounts and other European travels accounts, it is clear that Africans were knowledge experts of their geography. And the colonial maps that we see by the created by the late 19th century were basically deriving from the local knowledges about boundaries, routes, and the geography of Africans that Europeans learned and appropriated from the African guides. So from these knowledges, I also want to, think through ideas of class and race in terms of mobilities. And I want to argue that race and class really shaped the politics of travel in profound ways, as we have seen in the previous, accounts. From my reading, while it is not clear that how African chiefs distinguished between different white travelers, it looks like they preferred those from Britain and Germany, because as other African chiefs like Makombe, Mpende stated, the Germans and the British gave them valuable gifts. The Portuguese, on the other side, were seen as permanent enemies because of their long history of slave raiding and other wars that they had fought. This is not to say that white travelers were not participating in slave trading. Makombe, for example, is quoted by one traveler, Carl Peters, in 1899, having said, to reply to Makombe's request to travel, to Peter's request to travel, Makombe said, "Though and thy brothers are welcome, I am pleased to see Englishmen and Germans with me. Only Portuguese are not allowed to come here. But now I hear thou thyself hast Portuguese in thy presence. That surprises me, for should he enter my country, I would have to kill him. I am afraid that if I allow thee travel through my own country, and if thou gettest real estate, the Portuguese will follow thee. Now I am at war with them, and I intend to remain at war. My fathers have fought them since many, many years, kare kare. I carry the ring of one of their greatest ones on my neck. I have killed Signori Gouverne. I will not have any Portuguese. I will kill them if they come to thy service." So from my reading of these accounts, it really, it is really striking how different registers of descriptions on the relationships of African chiefs and travelers, European travelers, shifted. While others expressed the fear of Africans about European travels, others also explained the great excitement of Africans in facilitating or hosting Europeans. But in these exchanges or in these travels, what is also really striking for me is that African chiefs had the power to deport travelers or even detain or arrest others. These, if you want to think in terms of modern ways of travel, could be related to what happens in modern day travel ports. From my reading of travel accounts, European travelers frequently complained about being detained for various reasons, including the suspicion that African chiefs had about white travelers, as well as their failure to meet local travel protocols. Travelers such as Selu, having been detained by a powerful king, Lobengula, was also later detained in 1877 along the Zambezi until the Batonga chief approved his request and provided him with guides to the Portuguese trading station. These relationships were not always hostile. And like I said, European travelers also were very excited about, just being hosted in joyful hospitality and being assisted by African chiefs and travel guides. In some cases, the travel guides had conflicts with Europeans who sometimes defected payments or even cheated Africans. The labors of providing guidance when often involved in series of contradictions and conflicts. For the most part, why Europeans thought that African information was not important, it was really important. And some African guides decided to withhold information, to censor information, for example, when they were underpaid, for example, when they were hungry. They could also, kill animals that Europeans were using for travels. However, it is evident, from my reading that along the way, African travelers or African guides, including expert hunters, shown or have demonstrated their abilities to remember different parts, and they've demonstrated their expertise to know their boundaries and their terrains. Complaints about African stealing are also, from Europeans, are also very much dominant in these accounts. While whether they are true, that's another thing, but I'm interested in reading them as some form of agencies. Some other Europeans also...
Sorry to interject, Nick. 5 minutes left.
Okay, thank you. I'm about to round off. Some other Europeans also complained that Africans diverted their routes to just see their friends or to drink beer, which is really interesting because everyday travel is about, getting food. It's about getting physical strength in different ways. So from my reading and from what I've just shared with you, I want to, argue or conclude that the encounters of travel and guided mobilities were complex and involved different contestation and exchanges of competing knowledges. The mobilities of people and their ideas had local as well as transnational character, involving different exchanges about geography, boundaries, paths, stories, and so on. Without African guides in both physical and philosophical terrains, travels were simply impossible. And in my paper, I also talk about impossible mobilities, which I couldn't share because of time now. Mobility has always been a guided experience over time. And through these mobilities, people were able to generate maps, mental or physical ones. And then these knowledges were passed from generation to another and exploited by European travelers in the late 19th century to create boundaries that were aimed at controlling African populations. But their attempts to remake and control Africans were always resisted, as my chapter 3 will focus on everyday forms of resistance across boundaries. I'll stop there, Brian. Thank you so much for giving me this time.
Thank you very much, Nick, for a very stimulating conversation. I'm sure everyone can just give him like a round of applause or tap that icon right there. Thank you very much. So we now open the platform to discussions. Any questions and any comments pertaining to the presentation by Nick, you can either use the raise your hand function or navigate through by just putting on your mic and speaking. If there's any questions.
Hey, Nick, sorry I missed part of your talk. But I just wanted to know if there was a spiritual dimension to indigenous map making and knowledge about the local terrain.
Mm-hmm. Brian, I think there's a hand.
Oh, yes. Diamond. Yes, Diamond. I see your hand. Yes.
Mr. Nyachega, for the presentation. Just a quick one. With regards to the term borderlanders, is it, I'm just wondering, is it safe or proper to use that term, particularly in the period under discussion before colonization, especially in the context that, soon after colonialism, Africans do not recognize, the existence of that border. So should we use that term, particularly for the pre-colonial period? Thank you.
Okay, and I'll see. Okay, while let's wait for the second round of questions, Nick, I'll give you a chance to respond to those few questions.
Okay, thank you, Brian, and thank you, Abraham and Diamond, for those questions. And I think, Abraham, your question is really important to what I'm thinking about in terms of the spiritual dimension of space and travel. And in Manyika, I think that's really an important part, which I also examined in my paper. I didn't have a chance to go through that. But what you see is that the ideas of space, for example, in Manyika, included creating spaces that people were not, that were spiritual in physical terms, like shrines, such as, if you want to talk about places like Zimbabwe-Mozambique or the Bingaguru, where Mutasa lived. No one, not everyone else was allowed to go to those places unless it's for a spiritual activity. So that is very important, Abraham, and I want to keep developing that idea going forward. But indeed, the Manyika landscape and ideas of mapping were spiritual, and their mobilities were guided. And
sorry, just to then add on to Abraham's question and your response, notwithstanding the spiritual element that has been brought about or constructed by the community, how much of it can we say was a result of just trying to police society as opposed to being based on any realities per se? I asked this, I remember growing up in primary school, I had a fear of going to Inyanga, the Inyanga mountain in the Eastern Highlands, because I was told that if you're walking up, if you go putting on shoes, you won't come down. Or if you go, you have to climb up the mountain silently. If you speak or make any sound, something bad will happen to you. And so within this context of also, you do mention the African guides and knowing which paths to take and which paths not to take. How much can we say was based on factual realities as opposed to policing both society and maybe preservation of certain environmental spaces by the Africans at this within these different communities?
I think that's an important question, Brian. And what I can say is that it's a combination of many things why these spiritual spaces were created. And I want to argue that these spaces, spiritual spaces, were created based on realities. Today, if you go to, there are recent stories about people getting lost in the Inyanga Highlands. And contemporary medias have that information. For example, as recent as 2015, travelers got lost in the Inyanga Highlands. And from my research, local hunters also share stories of people getting lost, what they call kutetereka, in the hunting grounds. For example, for disregarding hunting taboos, or others have encountered some strange things and disregarded. For example, some have been laughing on trees that look like women. And I think there's a whole lot of literature by earlier scholars who state that for those travelers who were teased by these things they experienced, they could get lost and never to be found. So I want to develop that idea and provide more details. And what I've shared with you is just work in progress. I haven't done what my dissertation fieldwork would require me to. I haven't spent more than 8 months doing this work. So I will do that work again, but it's there. It's true that these spaces were defined based on reality, but they also meant to police people's behaviors and movements, as well as to protect sacred spaces and environments. And to Diamond's question about the use of borderland, I think that's an important question which I need to also think about. But for now, for convenience, I'm using this term to think about individuals who moved around boundaries, individuals with an enterprising attitude, individuals who, even when they knew that Chief so-and-so had the boundary or their territory ended here, they still could, traverse those boundaries, even in the pre-colonial context. So I want to further develop that concept, but I'm using it for convenience in this talk.
Oh, okay. Thank you for those responses. We'll then take a second set of questions. We'll start with David, then Terence. You can then see that. And then Nick, while these questions are going on, there's a comment by Abraham in the chat that you may also want to perhaps just look at.
Yeah, I think those are really good comments, interesting comments, Abraham. And I also, conceptualize these spiritual spaces as Zimbabwe-Mozambique, and by that, these places are sacred, and not everyone is allowed to be in such spaces. And as Abraham says, it was, also meant to manage ethics, and these also were philosophical terrains. You cannot travel along Honde Valley landscapes without really knowing what to not do or what to do. And growing up, I've been guided through this Zimbabwe of sacred landscapes by elders. Sometimes approaching one's homestead has also a spiritual dimension. The home is a sacred space. You don't just jump into one's homestead without asking for permission, using the local word "dishikeo," which means can I enter, right? So I think it's also a question of those ethics, Abraham, and everyday ways of doing things. Diana Jita also comments around travel seem to have resonance with current practice of NGOs and external academics. I think so. And what you also see, another resonance is recently how regions like the Honde Valley have become tourist destinations. And that's one thing that I'm thinking about, really the role of local communities, what the government is also doing to seek for permission or to disrespect local communities, and how individuals are also exploiting the knowledge and the landscapes of Honde Valley and Inyanga for tourist reasons and for profiting. And NGOs, of course, also are seen in these, current dimensions of travel and, people's mobilities in these regions.
Sorry, Nick, can we give David and Terence a time to give you questions, then you just respond to them all one time?
Okay.
Thank you.
So first of all, thank you, Nick, for a really, really great talk. I really enjoyed it. I have two somewhat related questions. So the first one is, did all of these interactions and guided mobilities you're talking about change overall communal mobilities and ideas of mobility? And the second question is, you talked, I think, very well and very clearly about the ways in which these guided mobilities created mental or physical maps. So were these ways of mapping shared? Was there some element of protection or secrecy over them? I'd love to hear more about that.
Brian?
Yes. Terence, if you could also just add the questions so Nick can respond to the questions collectively.
It's okay. Thank you very much, Nick, for the talk. I hope you hear me. My network is not so stable.
Yeah, I hear you.
My question is, to what extent did these guides, African guides, contributed to the creation of modern maps or the colonial maps? Because I see most Africanist scholars have taken away African agency in the creation of our current boundaries. So to what extent did they help in creating current borders? Thank you.
Yeah, really great questions. I hope I'll be able to address some of them in the remaining time. Dave, thank you for those two questions that you raised. I think really things of questions of change over time are really important. Unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to go through that. But what you realize is, ideas have changed over time, and some, philosophies, some maps have endured, some have been changed by different cultural circumstances, for example, in economic conditions. In this period that I'm interested in, what you see also from the 1850s to about the 1880s, the travels and philosophies were in a different political situation, because, for example, the travelers had no sense of authority compared to the period where colonization had officially begun and when boundaries had been created. So, for example, travelers who came in the 1900s would feel more authoritative and in their dealings with African guides. Some also could even retaliate, or even punish Africans for what their behaviors were. But the idea of Africans, even lying in some instances, or their agencies, continued. For example, into the 1900s, throughout the colonial period, where some guides, African guides, lied to border patrol officers about distances, about who was who, and so on. So others also lied about directions to avoid, going through sacred spaces. And I see that also in accounts where African chiefs really simply stopped travelers to go through hunting grounds and other spaces. But I want to, develop more on that idea, and I'll keep thinking about this idea of secrecy and other things. Terence, thank you. Indeed, the knowledge that Africans shared with Europeans contributed large also to the creation of colonial boundaries. And there's an argument usually among African borderland historians and other historians that colonial boundaries were created largely in disregard or without looking at the practical realities of African life, which, if you look at the Mozambique-Zimbabwe border today, that idea is questioned, because boundaries, for example, in pre-colonial Manyika, were defined by rivers, and my chapter 1 talks about that mapping. Rivers such as Pungwe, rivers such as Ruera that I have shown in the scenes, were used by African chiefs as their boundaries. So what do colonial officials do? Mountains like the Changwena Mountain, which were also boundaries in pre-colonial times, were then used by colonial officials. And it is on some of those mountains and rivers where the colonial beacons were put in place in the 1890s. So I also, in my chapter 1, provide a map on where these beacons are located on top of mountains, mountains like Changwena Mountain, Zaramira Mountain, and others, and rivers such as Pungwe, which also became the boundaries between colonial states. If you look to the Zambezi River has been used by locals as a boundary, like Chief Mpende and others, and the Batonga chiefs. And colonial officials used that boundary as well to draw, the boundaries of northern Rhodesia or southern Rhodesia, Zambia, and Zimbabwe today.
Okay, thank you very much, Nick, for those responses. I see there's a very interesting conversation taking place in the chat box. Unfortunately, all the conversations, I can't really quite capture them, but most of the questions and comments have been responded to. I don't know if there's anyone else with any burning question. I cannot see any hands raised. We also have a few minutes left before we end the session. So in about 2-3 sentences, Nick, not 4, just 2 or 3, can you just give us a nice sum up of this work and perhaps also an insight into your doctoral work that is currently ongoing?
Okay, thank you, Brian. I wish I could, take time to also look at some of the comments, but we can continue this conversation. And Brian, do you mind sharing my email in the chat if you have it by you, or I can just put that up so colleagues can keep this conversation with me. We can set up a Zoom for other discussions outside of this platform. I can just type my email in a minute. please reach out to me. I'll be happy to hear what you say. So what I am doing at the moment, Brian, is, kind of waiting to do my field work. And this is why I've also thought of trying to remodel my methodology to look into travel accounts, things that I had not previously thought about. And when I get a chance to travel, I want to conduct more ethnographic research. I want to look into Manyika traditions. I want to look into Manyika words. I want to go to these spaces. Of course, I've been to some of these spaces before, but I want to try to think more about the questions that's raised today in this talk. And as I have said, I've shared an idea of what my dissertation is, what my chapter 1 is, and what my current chapter is on mobilities. The next chapter I'm thinking would be on everyday, forms of resistance in these borderlands, because I'm now thinking the colonial boundaries and these contestations. When the boundary is created, what happens to African chiefs? What happens to African travelers? I'm also interested in questions of tax evasion and questioning state categories such as, evasion, such as smuggling and other things. Part of it will also talk about stories of travelers, such as, migrant workers. I'm also really interested in guided mobilities during the Liberation War, as people like, Robert Mugabe were guided and recruited by the Tangwena people into Mozambique. So that's another story for what I'm looking at. And I also want to center my own lived experiences, my family's lived experiences. I've crossed these, colonial state boundaries. I know where the local boundaries are. I know how they contradict with state ways of doing things. And I want to, talk about the contemporary times with regards to access to services, schools, clinics, and other things. My friends growing up in school came from the so-called Mozambique side of the border, but we didn't think about boundaries growing up. So I want to keep thinking about that idea and see how that works. I hope, things will work well for me, and I will look forward to sharing my drafts with colleagues and see how this develops.
Very interesting work you want to do, and we wish you the best. We wish you all the best in your studies and in your research, and we hope you enjoy it and encroach boundaries legally and not illegally. Thank you everyone for attending today. We can just give Nick a round of applause. Just tap the sharp icon or the one of the balloons. Thank you very much for attending this session. Do join us next week again. We have another exciting Zimbabwe Historical Seminar series. Same time, 3:30. That's South African Standard Time. We will send the link and the presentation poster during the course of the week. But otherwise, stay safe, sanitize, wear masks, do what keeps you safe and healthy.
And cross boundaries.
And cross boundaries.
You guided
Thank
always.
you very much.